Okay, look, I'll try and keep this video as snappy as I can, but get yourself a coffee. This is my fourth take already, and it's not a video that's easy to make to a snappy one. This is a video response to a guy called SJW101, the political gamer. He says he's called that on YouTube. I doubt his friends call him that. I doubt when he rings his folks up on a Sunday afternoon, they call him that. That's what he calls himself on YouTube. He has made a video, a message to anti-feminists at the end of the video. He asked me, amongst other people, he kind of tagged me to make a video response. Let me say before I get any further, I do not make video responses just because I've been tagged. I also don't make video responses because I've been goaded into it in a comment response he made to me when he said, I do hope you address this video and that you are frank with the anti-feminists and that you don't shilly-shally. Listen, mate, if I'm making a video response, I choose both what's going to be in that video response and the tone that I'm going to take. Right, that's my business. It's not for you to tell me what is going to be in that video response or what tone it will take. Now, with regards to giving a message to anti-feminists, I did it in my message to feminists. I made it quite clear, talking about those self-serving biases, the unconscious way that we have them, and how we need to try and be aware of them, and that maybe that needs to stop us in our tracks sometimes and to reevaluate things. That went out to everybody. I made it quite clear in that video that didn't just apply to feminists, it applies to all people on all sides of all arguments and of all positions and of all engagements. Right, so I dealt with that already. What I want to talk about mainly in this is this business of anti-feminism. His video was a bit unclear. I've got to criticise it for this. I think this is a legitimate criticism. There were some good points he made in his video. Start of the video, he says, I'm going to talk to the non-feminists, to the anti-feminists, to the anti-feminist content creators. I was watching his video and I got several minutes in and I thought, he's supposed to be talking to the non-feminists first. He seems to have moved on, segued into the anti-feminists, but I can't remember where he said, right, now I'm talking to the anti-feminists. So I went back and he never did, and I watched the same bit again. And then he says, now I'm going to address the anti-feminists. And I thought, well, who have you just been addressing? You've just discussed anti-feminists and why. You've just given the definition of anti-feminism and why you suggest that we reject anti-feminism on those grounds. And yet that is in the section where you're supposed to be talking to the non-feminists. And I assume he understands the difference between the two when he leaves a comment to somebody saying, fucking genius. He wasn't talking to me at the time, although obviously that might give you an indication that he was. I never identified as a feminist. I never said I was a feminist. So he leaves a comment like that, so he can obviously differentiate between not being a feminist and being an anti-feminist, which he doesn't regard himself as, we know that much. And yet he just muddied the waters with the video. Now, one thing that I'm really interested in, and I want to get clear from the outset, and this is something that I've changed my position on very recently, and this is this business of self-identification. So be aware of this, and I think we all need to be aware of the way of keeping apart the way in which people identify and the way that we label them. Right, and I've tried to rail against that, but I've recently realised it's just a waste of time. You've just got to deal with the two things separately, and what's led me to that is some of the videos that I've made. In fact, I finished editing the latest one last night on atheist statistics within the UK. And within the UK, the percentage of people who call themselves an atheist is smaller. It's about half the number of people who we would identify as an atheist based on the definition of atheism. In other words, they lack a belief in a god or gods, and yet not all of them call themselves an atheist. So we would identify them as an atheist, we would label them as an atheist under any reasonable set of parameters, but they don't self-identify as an atheist. So I think that's really important. And one of the ways in which that's changed the way I'm going to try and talk about myself is that I'm not going to say I am not a feminist anymore. I'm also not going to say I am not an MRA anymore. I'm going to say I don't identify as an MRA. I don't identify as a feminist. And I think that's really important when we're talking about anti-feminists, because it's very, very difficult to pin down what an anti-feminist is in the fucking first place. But one of the factors has to be self-identification. Let me try and explain why. So I've been away from home for a few days, and I'd watched a Thunderfoot video where he was having a bit of a pop, to put it lightly, at Aron. And right at the start of that video, there's a clip of Aron And he does get a little bit quote mining with his clips sometimes, Thunderfoot, but I've heard Aron Ra say the same kind of thing elsewhere. So I know that it's not the case here, where he's talking about feminism and how there's only one definition of feminism, and there's only ever been one definition of feminism, which has to class as the most fucking ludicrous thing he's ever said. Would he say that about Christianity, you know? Oh, there's only ever been one definition of Christianity, and what would that be? You know, the definition that he gives for feminism is a bare bones definition. It's not a bad definition, it's quite a good definition, but it's a bare bones definition. It's the same as saying Christianity is the belief that Jesus is not the Son of God. No, that's not the bare bones definition. He's the Jewish Messiah. He doesn't have to be the Son of God. He has to be the Jewish Messiah. That's what you have to believe to be a Christian. But is that really the only definition of Christianity? Of course it isn't. Some people's Christianity involves a lot more than that. As I showed again with some of the statistical analysis of the UK recently, a lot of people identify as Christians, and for them Christianity doesn't even involve a belief in God. Right? They don't even believe in God. It's a set of cultural values and cultural artifacts that they subscribe to, and that is what Christianity is for them. There's 1,001 definitions of Christianity. There's 1,001 definitions of feminism. If you've got 100 feminists in a room, one thing I can guarantee is you get 100 different fucking definitions, if not in terms of what they say, in terms of how they would apply it, because sometimes the way that people apply their definition is different to what they will actually just trot out. For example, Aron Ra, he talked about equality for women in terms of his definition, yet I've no doubt if you started talking about feminism, he would start bringing up men's issues as well, or issues of racial equality, which were nowhere within his fucking definition. And that is some people's definitions of feminism. It includes men's issues, I think to the detriment, I have to say, of men's issues, because it means that men's issues then get torn apart between two groups that are antagonistic in a way that women's issues do not. And of course we then have that kind of hypocrisy, feminism as a movement campaigning against using gendered terms for things which are gender neutral, and yet, well, we're going to retain the name feminism for historical reasons, even though it's about men's issues as well as women's issues. How that argument doesn't apply to words like chairman and fireman as well, I don't know, but apparently it applies to feminism. But this is the thing, if you get a men's issues feminist in a room with perhaps a political lesbian or a radfem that says that men are the problem, that men are the oppressor class, right, in what way are their definitions of feminism the same? Of course they're not. So we have, in actual fact, despite the guff that Aron Ra talked, a huge number of definitions of feminism, which makes it difficult to define anti-feminism. And then bear in mind what I said on a video recently, if you saw it, which was that there's different levels of feminism, right? It's so unclear what we're referring to. Feminism is a goal. It's also an ideology that overarches that goal. It's also a movement. Right, it's a movement primarily about women's rights, and then it's also an academic area of study with this whole body of work, feminist theory, which incorporates patriarchy theory and gender theories and all this kind of thing. Right, so these are all very, very different things, aren't they? And what does it mean to be an anti-feminist? What is it you're really railing against? Are you railing against the goal, or are you railing against the movement, or are you railing against it as an academic area of study? Because those are very, very different things to oppose. Now, the reason that I bring this up is because reason to bring it up is because I think it's a really interesting thing to discuss. But the other thing that I bring it up is because in his video SJW101, and let me bring it up here, he brings up this definition of anti-feminism, right, which I'll show you. And it's really interesting to consider this definition here, because what he says is anti-feminism is broadly defined as ideological opposition to some or all forms of feminism. Now, this is a Wikipedia definition, and despite the criticisms that people have of Wikipedia, one of the marvellous things about Wikipedia is that most pages like this are disputed, and because they're disputed, it means you get a kind of consensus opinion that involves input from both sides, antagonistic input, which I think gives a more robust, less biased definition. But I think this definition is shit. And the reason that I think this definition is shit is that you tell me of a single person under this definition that is not an anti-feminist. You tell me a single feminist that is not an anti-feminist. You name me a single feminist that does not have an ideological opposition to some forms of feminism, because feminism is such a broad church that if you are aligned with some parts of feminism and identify as a feminist, then you are bound into being ideologically opposed to some other forms of feminism. So it's not really a very, very good definition. We need some kind of extra element in there. It seems to me, what's the difference between Kevin Logan and Sargon of Akkad? Well, obviously they've got different views, but with regard to their status of a feminist, Kevin Logan identifies as a feminist and doesn't identify as an anti-feminist. Sargon of Akkad identifies as an anti-feminist, doesn't identify as a feminist. But both of them have ideological oppositions to some forms of feminism, but claim to have no problem with some other forms of feminism. So I think it's really, really important to bear all of that in mind when we start to talk about anti-feminists or address anti-feminists, because what the fuck does it mean? And that's why I think self-identifying is really important, because I think with regard to anti-feminism, because feminism itself is so disparate in terms of its definitions, and then has this structured approach of goal, ideology, movement, academic area of study, there's so many things that you could be talking about there, that then when you add another little cloud of bullshit and lack of clarity when we move to anti-feminism, that really it's very difficult. It's a silly label to start pinning on people. It's really something that you should only rely on people self-identifying as. Right, that's what I wanted to say about all of that. I want to play you a few clips of what SJW101 actually says in his video that I wanted to make a few comments on.
To take an example, do not deny that there is a wage gap, or talk about the wage gap myth. There is a wage gap. You are free to debate the extent of the gap with evidence and to postulate why that might be. But when you deny the most basic facts, it shows you aren't really interested in debate at all.
The wage gap. What a bone of contention. And the wage gap myth. I don't want to go too much into the wage gap. I probably will end up going a bit more than I'd hoped in terms of the wage gap. But the wage gap myth, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what people are talking about, and it isn't always clear. And I admit that when I read a comment and somebody talks about the wage gap myth, I don't know whether they're saying the wage gap is a myth or that the way it's portrayed is grossly misleading, but they're two very, very different things. You can liken it, to go back to the religious example, to the ways in which people talk about the Jesus myth. When people talk about the Jesus myth, some people are suggesting that it's all bullshit, that there was never this guy called Jesus who was the Son of God. He didn't exist. The whole historical figure is wrong. It's an ahistorical figure. It was all made up after the fact. And then other people say, well, no, when you look at the evidence, there probably was an apocalyptic Jewish preacher who called himself Jesus, or maybe he wasn't called Jesus, but it's based on a real life figure. But of course that figure was not the Jewish Messiah. How could he be? He got killed. That's not very messianic, and he certainly isn't the Son of God. That was all added after the fact, but the actual person exists. So there's very different interpretations of what the Jesus myth entails. And it's the same thing here with regard to the wage gap myth. Some people deny that there's really any wage gap, or in material terms, when what they regard as acceptable factors are taken into account, there is no wage gap. Some people are taking a very different perspective and saying, well, there is still a gap, but it's a lot smaller than this headline figures in the States, the 77 cents in a dollar. Because what most people are trying to do is to differentiate between those factors such as working more hours of overtime, which you'd say, well, that's just if somebody wants to work out more hours of overtime, because it's done on sort of actual total earnings in the States, right? Those factors which are acceptable and which aren't really sexist in that regard, and those which maybe are, right? And try and differentiate them. Now, in my video Feminism and More, when I talked about the wage gap, what I tried to show is that it isn't even always clear which camp these things go in. It's very, very complicated to dissect, and yet we have this fucking annual process of having to dissect it. And every time we have the annual process, the conversation just resets again from this headline figure, which just takes this blunt statistic of what the average woman earns and what the average man earns, and that is the wage gap. And then we're left to start the bun fight all over again. In the States, it's based on this total earnings. In the United Kingdom, for those of you, I go into more detail with this in the video Feminism and More, but it's based on hourly rate, which I think is a better way of doing it. It gets us away from the overtime thing. But again, there's a misreporting in the UK figures. In the UK figures, it shows a wage gap of about 17%. In terms of full-time workers' hourly rate, the wage gap stands at 10%. That's not accounting for difference in occupational fields and all the factors that are involved in that. But across all fields, full-time workers, it's about 10%. So where does this 17% come from? Well, actually, there's a bigger gap in part-time workers. It's a figure that you never heard reporting, presumably because it's not politically very expedient to report it, because the figure goes in the wrong direction. Part-time men earn less per hour than part-time women earn per hour. Nobody seems to give a fuck about that, but that is true. Now, the reason we get this 17% figure then of men earning more than women is because effectively it's a function of full-time workers earning so much more than part-time workers as an hourly rate, and such a much higher percentage of women working part-time as working full-time. So every time you have this figure, what you never get is the fact that it never shows alongside those figures the amount of times the average father has had to spend with his children, enjoying seeing his children growing up, and the amount of time the average mother has spent with her children, enjoying being with her children and seeing her children grow up, because largely that is what a large portion of that is about, that gap, which is that women feel enabled upon having a child. Men go back to work within a few days and they're working full-time, and that's what's expected, and they never really have a choice within a relationship or within society to reduce their hours. I don't know a single man in my whole life experience who's gone down to 4 days a week or 3 days a week because he's become a father, but I know lots and lots and lots and lots of mothers who've done so. In fact, I probably know more mothers who've done so than mothers who haven't done so, at least for a few years. So after 6 or 9 months off maternity, they're then going back to a part-time basis, often in different areas of work, and they're doing that as a choice so that they can enjoy. They don't want to be working full 40 hours a week, 5 days a week. They want to be spending more time with their children, and they feel enabled to make that choice. As a result of that, women are working more part-time work and getting paid less, because part-time work tends to pay less, not just for women. In fact, the gap, as I've said, is much greater for men between full-time and part-time than it is for women. So that's a significant area that is not represented within the statistics. If that's what you're talking about in terms of a wage gap myth, I don't think that's even anti-feminist, right? That's just looking at it from a purely neutral perspective, I would suggest. But then we have this other perspective of wage gap myth, which is just to say, well, there isn't such thing as a wage gap, which is ridiculous, because even if you think the whole thing is explainable, there clearly is a gap, whether you like it or not, because the statistics show there is a gap. So that's pretty much what I wanted to say with regard to that. Let's move on to the next bit.
To take another example, blanket statements about feminism being unnecessary. The debate about the necessity of feminism in the West is arguable, but there is no question that feminism is necessary in the majority of countries around the world.
So I want to contrast what I say here between specifically, explicitly, the necessity of feminism, necessity, versus whether it's useful or whether it's a positive or a good thing or whether it serves some kind of benefit, which is a different thing. I'm interested in the subject of necessity because it turns into this whole business of some kind of socio-political land grab, which tends to go on, and of taking ownership of anything, because there are some people who say that pretty much anything, there's for some people who really anything that involves equality and rights for anybody, if something positive happens, then that's feminism. That's just feminism by definition, that feminism is responsible because it's an issue of equality. So if somebody has done some movement with regard to equality, then feminism can take ownership of it. Of course, some other people take a very different perspective on that. And to give you an example of what I mean by that, because I know that you talk SJW101 elsewhere about MRAs and feminists, contrast these two different people who work for men's rights. You have the YouTuber Captain Mickle, who regards himself as both a feminist and an MRA, and sees no conflict between being both of those things, because he's for equality for women and women's rights, but he also campaigns for men's rights, and he sees that as inevitably means that he is a men's rights activist, because he literally advocates for men's rights. Then compare that to somebody like Ali Fogg, who you may have come across, and who I recommend if you haven't, who very much is in the in the feminist category, and doesn't have any time for the men's rights movement, does not regard himself as an MRA, has nothing good to say about MRAs, and yet he devotes almost all of his time dealing with issues which are men's rights issues, and he's a very, very worthy advocate, I would suggest, of men's rights. So we come again into this whole issue of self-identification. Ali Fogg does not self-identify as a men's rights advocate, and yet to an external person such as myself, what is he if he is not a men's rights advocate? So does the work that he does come under the auspices of men's rights advocacy, and does he show that men's rights advocacy is necessary? Because look at all these very worthy issues that he's dealing with, which are men's rights issues. Or do all these issues come under the umbrella of feminism and show the necessity of feminism? Do you see what I'm driving at here? So sure, there are issues that women have that need to be addressed, but what I'm saying is, do they have to be addressed under the auspices of feminism, or is there something intrinsic about it? That just the simple fact that they have those issues, if those issues are being addressed, well then that's feminism, and that's just all there is to it, right? So that's kind of where I'm at with that. So it's really kind of unclear when we talk about the necessity of feminism. You can easily end up arguing past one another with regards to that. It's a lot better, I think, to talk about whether there are genuine issues that need to be addressed in the West or in the rest of the world, and then to have a discussion separately about whether any way of addressing those, do they automatically come under the grounds of feminism? In other words, are we imposing from above a definition on what is going to be regarded as feminism, or do people self-identify as to the work that they're doing and saying, no, the work that I'm doing here, championing these issues, I'm doing it under the umbrella of feminism, or bollocks to that, I've no time for feminism, I'm dealing with these issues, but I'm not doing it under the umbrella of feminism. What perspective do we take there? And if that isn't enough to convince you that this idea of the necessity of feminism is kind of a little bit too murky really to know what it means, you've then got this other axis of murk, which is this talking about feminism on different levels as a goal or as an ideology or as a movement or as an area of academic understanding where, you know, what are you saying is necessary? That it's necessary that we regard equality of opportunity as a goal, for example, or that we have a movement that people can get behind that will champion explicitly women's issues? Are we saying that that is a necessity, or are we saying it's a necessity that we make a series of ad hoc post hoc explanations for every single fucking thing that happens that blames it on the patriarchy? Of course, these are all very, very different things to say that are necessary, and just because you subscribe to one doesn't mean that you'd have any time whatsoever for one of those other things. So that's kind of like the issue that I had with that.
Because this gravy train has certainly been kind to you, hasn't it? You'd be screwed if feminism vanished, and we both know it. Let's think about that. It essentially means that you have an interest in feminism continuing on a self-serving basis. The more extreme feminism becomes, the more you will benefit. With this interest, why would anybody suppose that you are interested in telling them the truth?
So I wanted to add this bit. I've left out quite a lot of it because I didn't really feel it applied to me. I didn't particularly have any comments to make. Some of it I agreed with, and I thought he made some reasonable points in his video. I wanted to talk about this because he talks about this as a gravy train, but of course it's to paraphrase, it's gravy trains all the way down, and I think he kind of almost refers to that at one point. And this is a point I've made before with people criticising Anita Sarkeesian. I've had enough criticisms of Anita Sarkeesian, but I've tried to keep them to her arguments. or to specific areas of what I've seen as hypocrisy or hidden agendas that she may have. I've never criticised her for riding on a gravy train, because of course she's riding on a gravy train. She has seen feminism as a vehicle for her to make a name for herself and to make a career, and for her to found some arguments, which most in the main I'm sure that she believes most of what she says, but that's what she's seen as a suitable vehicle. And so she's riding on a gravy train, and of course other people are riding a gravy train based on her gravy train. Of course they are. And that's maybe a reason not to criticise her, because as soon as you do so, you're riding on a gravy train. And I'm acutely aware that I am in many ways riding on a gravy train on the backs of people like both Anita Sarkeesian and Thunderfoot and a great number of other people when I comment on the things that they say. And SJW101 is when he makes a video recently commenting on a video that I'd made about prostitution. So we're all riding on these different gravy trains. I don't think there's anything intrinsically wrong in that. In fact, Christopher Hitchens made a comment years back, obviously because he had to have been alive to have done it, but somebody asked him about Christianity. Would you like to see Christianity die out? And he said, of course not. I'd have nobody left to argue with if that was to happen. I'm sure that's not exactly true in Christopher Hitchens' case, because he had a wide gamut of things that he talked about. But this is a large part of journalism, and it doesn't matter whether you read the Times or the Guardian or whatever, both great papers with high editorial and journalistic standards. I'm sure SJW101's more of a Guardian fan, right? A lot of the columnists in the Guardian, they wouldn't have any material if there wasn't people on the right talking shite and misportraying things. They wouldn't have any material. And it's the same thing with the Times. If there wasn't people on the left talking shite, misportraying things, they wouldn't have a lot of the material that the columnists have there. We all rely on this, don't we? There's no debate if there's nothing to debate. And I don't think that's specifically something to decry people for. And I think that it's the viewer that has to take ownership of this. If you're watching a channel like some of these anti-feminist channels he's talking about, you have to accept that you're going to get a particularly polarized perspective, same as if you were reading a feminist article or looking at a feminist channel. And you really need, the onus is on you to go and try and get a bit of both sides, and maybe try and also uncover a few people who show a bit of both sides and who try and draw a bit of both. Don't really feel like they've got some huge dog in the fight and feel enabled, as I feel enabled. I mean, one of the things that I find lucky about where I'm at on YouTube, and the tremendous support that I get that enables me to do that via Patreon now to keep doing what I do, is that I've built up, I think, a viewership, a subs base, and a series of patrons that expect me not necessarily to take the side that they are on always, right? They have an expectation of that, so they don't really feel let down by that. What they expect from me is honesty, and for me to have considered both sides, even if I don't end up siding with both sides. Even if I end up taking a side, I'll at least try to have considered both sides from both sides. I'm very lucky in that. Not everybody is in that position. Not being in that position hamstrings you a little bit in terms of what you can say. And let's be honest, there are channels that are in that position. But channels like that are also very, very important, because you need those, but they need to be not viewed in isolation. That's the critical thing. If you're only watching the Thunderfoots, if you're only watching the Sargon, the Cads and Vernaculars and Bearings and all these different people, then you're not really going to get a very rounded opinion. The same as if you only read fucking Amanda Marcotte and Jessica Valenti, or if you only watch Lacey Green, if you only watch Steve Shives, you're not going to get a very rounded position on these things, because there are kind of limits in what they are going to say with regard to some of these issues. And that's just the fact of the way that the whole world works, not just on YouTube, but in the proper sphere of proper journalism, it works in exactly the same way. What I want to say to sum up this video, the last video that I made, the message to feminists, I made a message to feminists with regards to these biases, these self-serving biases, which are largely unconscious, subconsciously made, but said that these are something that we should all be aware of. If I'm going to give a message to anti-feminists, it's a message that applies to everybody, I think, which is that I think all of these subjects would benefit if we spent less time talking about feminists and anti-feminists and more time talking about the individual subjects, right? If you want to talk about the wage gap, Have a discussion about the wage gap. Don't have a discussion about feminists and the wage gap and anti-feminists and the wage gap, because it ends up getting mired in discussions about feminism and anti-feminism and all this bullshit. Try and spend more time. That would be what I would like to advocate. Spend more time dealing with issues as issues rather than trying to bundle them together into socio-political ideologies, which then disenfranchise people from certain aspects of those discussions. Okay, I think that's pretty much what I wanted to say with regard to his video. As I always say, give the video, the original video, a watch, because that's the fair and reasonable thing to do, and then you can make your own decision on that content. Okay, thank you for watching. Bye for now.